Welcome to Module 19 of Interpersonal Communication, communication during the established stages of romantic relationships. In previous modules, we've talked about some of the research on how romantic relationships unfold over a series of stages, and we've used the research of Mark Knapp as the basis for that approach. You'll recall that Knapp believes that each romantic relationship unfolds through a series of integration phases and a series of disintegration phases. Those two phases are composed of various stages. Each stage is marked by certain communicative behaviors. So, once you understand the communicative behaviors, you can understand which stage you're in and get a very good handle on what kind of relationship is unfolding and how it is you might be able to better manage that relationship. In this module, we talk about the middle stages of that coming together or integration phase of a romantic relationship. In the previous module, we used Romeo and Juliet as an example of a romantic relationship, and we'll stick with that. So when we refer to the established stages of a romantic relationship, what we mean are the times when Romeo and Juliet are intensifying the romantic relationship. They're growing closer to one another, the relationship is deepening, the relationship is getting more serious. Both Romeo and Juliet see more of a future for the relationship. The later stages we'll talk about include stages such as bonding, where Romeo and Juliet might move in together, or they might get married. Anyway, the point is that in these established stages of romantic relationship, two people are a couple. The romantic relationship is working, it's probably healthy, it's a going concern, and the presumption among both people is the relationship will continue. So the question on the table in this module is, what's going on communicatively? What are the stages in this portion of the model, and how does communication work in those stages? You'll recall the first two stages in Mark Knapp's scheme are the initiation stage and the experimentation stage. In the initiation stage, we talked about research that said the key project was to signal interest in beginning a romantic relationship and in managing the impressions you have of yourself. The second stage is what's called experimentation, and that's when you're trying to reduce uncertainty and move the relationship along. Now we arrive in this module at the third stage. It's called intensification. The term intensification very nicely captures what's going on here, which is to say the relationship is beginning to intensify. It's beginning to grow in terms of the feelings you have for someone, in terms of the depth and the quality of the connection you have with someone, and just in terms of the way the relationship is unfolding. In short, it's working. And so it comes as no surprise that the key project for this stage is to deepen the relationship, to strengthen it, to give it roots, so to speak. This is the portion of the relationship where you begin to withstand the storms of a relationship. It's where you begin to build all the memories of the relationship. It's when you really believe this relationship is working out. And so communicatively, there are certain behaviors that tend to mark this intensification stage. For example, there tends to be a dramatic increase in the amount of time spent exclusively with the person you're involved with. This is the stage where people begin to shut themselves off from their friends. This is the stage where people begin to break away from other groups, such as family or friendship circles. Also, communicatively in this stage, there's the exchange of a token of affection. And typically, this token of affection has some kind of symbolic value. So, for example, this is when Romeo might give Juliet his hoodie, or this is when Romeo gives Juliet a significant gift, perhaps a piece of jewelry or something like that. This is when the two of them come to agree within their relational culture that something has value, and that by presenting that something of value to the other person, you're trying to communicate the intensity of your feelings. You're trying to suggest the relationship is, in fact, moving deeper. Also in this particular stage, there are what are called relational definers. Relational definers are those things that tend to mark the relationship as being particularly deep. So, for example, for many relationships, this is when people begin to become sexually active, or this is when they might meet the parents. Or this is when the two of them might take some kind of significant step that presents the couple as a more serious kind of relationship. So, for example, they might take a vacation together. So the idea then is that each of these things seems to symbolically or verbally or non-verbally communicate both to the other person and to those outside the relationship, this is serious. Earlier, we talked about William Rawlins's research on friendships. And one of the things that Rawlins said is that friendships oftentimes develop a unique relational language. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to romantic relationships. Mark Knapp's research here on romantic relationships finds that the intensification stage oftentimes includes a unique relational language. This is when you begin to develop nicknames for one another. This is when you develop a shorthand way of speaking. a way to refer to other people, or a way to signal to the other person that you're interested in the physical expression of affection. So communicatively, all these things come together, but notice one common thread among the things I just shared with you. Many of them are symbolic. And in fact, Knapp's research finds that oftentimes the symbolism is most important here in this intensification stage. You'll also notice we're trying to broaden the kinds of communication that occurred in the second experimentation stage. Many of the same things you used to do in the experimentation stage, like small talk and direct and indirect questions, continue on in this intensification stage. So really what we're doing is adding more communicative behaviors to the stages, and that's what makes it the intensification stage. Now, the intensification stage also tends to feature direct expressions of commitment. This is when people oftentimes say the phrase, "I love you," or this is when they begin to talk about a future together. And obviously this is where, because people have known each other long enough and established a clear-cut pattern of interaction, that there develops an affection exchange protocol. And that's kind of fancy terminology, but basically this is where you figure out what your partner's love language is. So this is where Romeo figures out what it is that Juliet needs to see or needs to hear in order for her to conclude that Romeo loves her or that Romeo values her. This is where Juliet begins to figure out exactly how it is Romeo wants to be supported during difficult times. Does he want to be left alone? Does he want to be able to vent to Juliet? Does he want Juliet to take him away from his troubles by getting out of town with him? What? And so these kinds of exchange patterns become embedded in the relationship. And so communicatively, both Romeo and Juliet begin to figure out how all of this stuff is going to work. Now, on that note, Charles Wilkinson is a researcher who studies these affection exchange patterns. And one of the things that Wilkinson talks about is the similarity of exchange patterns. So, for example, if Romeo and Juliet both desire to be supported during difficult times by being held, then the affection exchange strategies are similar. The patterns of affection exchange are similar. If Juliet's love language is words of affirmation and Romeo's love language is words of affirmation, then they're matched, they're balanced. And Wilkinson's research finds that means that couple is most likely to have a happy, satisfying relationship, at least when it comes to that part of their relationship. And so as you can see, there are a lot of things going on here with respect to how people interact with one another. Now there's another idea that animates this intensification stage, and it comes from researcher James Honeycutt. Honeycutt talks about what are called relational trajectories. This is a concept I talk about when I teach the oral communication course, and it goes like this. Honeycutt believes that in our minds, each of us have an imagined timeline, a trajectory, a pattern of development that we expect our relationships to follow. So for many people on a campus like Oklahoma Christian, it goes like this. Juliet arrives on the campus of a Christian university, and she's here to get a biology degree because she'd like to be a medical researcher. But she would also like perhaps to find a Christian spouse. Now, if it happens, that's great. If it doesn't happen, that's fine too. But in the back of her mind, she kind of wants it to happen. And so in her mind, there's an imagined trajectory. At some point in college, she'll meet a guy. They'll start to see one another, they'll make it official, they'll stay together, and they'll probably end up getting engaged sometime during their senior year. And in this trajectory, they don't break up with one another. They just move seamlessly from meeting to engagement and then ultimately to marriage. That's her relational trajectory. Now, Honeycutt says that each of us has, at least vaguely in our mind, some kind of relational trajectory. These trajectories can be informed by movies we've seen in the media, the experiences of our parents or our friends, or just what we imagine we'd like to have happen. Regardless, our communication is oftentimes influenced by these relational trajectories. So if Romeo, for example, has not yet told Juliet that he loves her, according to the timeline that Juliet thinks he should be telling her that he loves her, then Juliet is likely to be displeased. And so the relational trajectory that Juliet has in her head might lead to some friction or some conflict with Romeo because Romeo hasn't said, "I love you" on Juliet's timeline. So you see how the trajectory that we have in our head might influence the actual communication that occurs in a relationship. Now, a third idea we need to talk about here is also related to another notion broached previously in this course. Earlier, we talked about taboo topics. You might recall that in the previous module on friendship, we talked about Leslie Baxter and William Wilmot and their research on the demise of friendships. Well, when it comes to romantic relationships, Baxter and Wilmot have also studied taboo topics and how taboo topics work in romantic relationships. Their research finds that 9 out of 10 romantic couples have some kind of a taboo topic, which is to say some topic that both of them have either explicitly or implicitly agreed they will not talk about. And these taboo topics most often are developed here in the intensification stage of a romantic relationship. That's because the relationship is deepening to a point where they begin to understand enough about one another, about their histories, about how this relationship is working, that they're able to stumble onto or identify these taboo topics. And usually, taboo topics are identified because there's been some kind of a negative experience with them. So, for example, Juliet and Romeo might have been talking about one of Romeo's exes. Well, that leads to a big, huge blowout fight. And so Romeo and Juliet have basically agreed not to talk about Romeo's previous girlfriends. It becomes a taboo topic. That happens here in this intensification stage because sorting that out paves the way for the intensification stage to grow and then perhaps for the relationship to move to the stages beyond. Now, all of this talk about taboo topics in a romantic relationship might make you think to yourself, well, that can't be healthy, right? In fact, quite the opposite is true. The research finds that assuming the people involved are okay with putting a taboo topic in place in a relationship, then there isn't necessarily a negative detriment to that. Or to put it differently, if everybody's okay with it, it's fine to have taboo topics. In fact, most of the time taboo topics are put into place because of some positive motivation. You want to avoid conflict or you don't want to harm the relationship. And so the positive motivation for the taboo topics seems to be enough to make the taboo topics avoid a negative ramification. Now, that said, the problem with taboo topics comes when one person wants the topic to be taboo, but the other person does not. So if Romeo would like the taboo topic to be, let's not talk about my ex, then if Juliet wants to be able to talk about Romeo's exes, that's going to be a problem. And in that context, then the presence of a taboo topic in the relationship is likely to lead to negative results. So don't necessarily be afraid of taboo topics, but understand how it is with taboo topics in the larger context of the relationship. Now, a fourth idea that floats around the intensification stage is research that correlates certain kinds of communicative and social skills with the development of a relationship. In fact, much research finds that if Romeo and Juliet are doing certain things in this intensification stage, then that sets up their relationship for long-term success. So the question then becomes, what kinds of communicative skills specifically are important to make a romantic relationship hum along and be successful in this intensification stage? Well, one of them obviously is the successful management of conflict. In the intensification stage, this is where Romeo and Juliet will realize the importance of well-managed conflict. Earlier in this class, we talked about the research on conflict, and we said it wasn't the presence of conflict that's important, it's that conflict is well managed. And this intensification stage is where Romeo and Juliet either figure out how to manage conflict well, or they realize they don't do conflict well. So conflict management becomes an important kind of communicative skill that helps the intensification stage work out. Next is the notion of the proper provision of emotional support. In the intensification stage, you tend to experience the ups and downs of life with one another because you're so deeply committed. And in this intensification stage, the people involved in the romantic relationship have to figure out how to provide that emotional and social support. So how does Juliet help Romeo bounce back from a series of rejection letters when he's applied for a job? How does Romeo help Juliet navigate the difficulties she experiences with her family? The intensification stage of a romantic relationship is when the two of them figure this out. And so providing emotional support becomes an important way of navigating this third intensification stage. And then finally, there is this notion of negative assertion. Negative assertion is the idea that you're able to stand up for yourself. You're able to be assertive within the confines of a relationship without that going badly. So Juliet needs to be able to be assertive, to be able to negatively assert things to Romeo. She needs to be able to say, for example, to Romeo, don't be so sarcastic with me. I feel badly when you do that. Or Romeo wants to be able to say to Juliet, don't keep throwing into my face the fact that I'm a member of a family that has historically been at war with your family. So standing up for yourselves or asserting things that might lead to a negative impression is a really important skill that in the intensification stage, couples have to learn. Now, just because these three skills are in place doesn't mean the intensification stage is guaranteed to go along swimmingly. but it does mean that typically if these skills are in place, the relationship has a better chance of success. Well, the next idea that floats around in the intensification stage is what's called turning points theory. Connie Bullis, B-U-L-L-I-S, is the researcher who has done the most work on turning points theory. So far, Mark Knapp's notion is that relationships progress along in a linear fashion. You sequentially move from the initiation stage to the experimentation stage to the intensification stage. Well, in this intensification stage, Bullis argues that there's this thing called turning points theory. And she believes that rather than smoothly evolving from one stage to the next, that oftentimes what happens, especially in the intensification stage, is that relationships will lurch forward. There'll be a revolutionary sudden jump or a sudden decline in the relationship. And so her analysis wants to suggest that some particular event precipitates that sudden revolutionary change in the relationship. There is a turning point in the relationship. So the relationship was headed this direction, and then it has something happen that makes it go that direction or that direction. And so Bullis is interested in the kinds of events that act as turning points. So what she does in her research is she wants to identify those events and then try and track them for what effects they have on the relationship. So, for example, a clear turning point for Romeo and Juliet might be that if they go to school at Oklahoma Christian and the semester ends in April, if Romeo goes home to this city and Juliet goes home to that city, they're now thrust into a long-distance relationship context. That's a turning point in their relationship. Or when Romeo and Juliet first become sexually involved, that could become a turning point in their relationship. Or when Juliet moves in with Romeo, that becomes a turning point in their relationship. So Bullis talks about things that are events related to passion and romance, like when they begin to become sexually active. Or they have communication-based events, when, for example, Juliet shares with Romeo one of her deepest, darkest secrets and really becomes vulnerable to him. Or when Romeo meets Juliet's parents for the first time. Or when there's some kind of a significant crisis, like Romeo is diagnosed with a serious illness, or Juliet is involved in a car accident. The list of what could count as a turning point is a really long one, and frankly, it's highly idiosyncratic. It varies from person to person and from relationship to relationship. But make no mistake about it, Bullis believes that if you understand the turning points, then you're clearly in a better position to understand what's going on in this relationship. Now, let me share with you another idea that's tied to the intensification stage. I said earlier that the intensification stage often features a deepening of emotional connection. Frankly, this is when people tend to fall in love. Now, on that note, Warren Farrell has studied gender differences with respect to the notion of falling in love and beliefs associated with having been in love. And Farrell's research finds something really interesting. Compared to females, males fall in love faster. That is to say, in Farrell's research, males tend to come to a point where they understand the feelings they have as love. For females, oftentimes the labeling of those feelings is what's precipitated for them to understand that they've fallen in love. Now, also interestingly enough in Farrell's research, males are more likely to believe that love conquers all. Or to put it differently, males are more likely to believe that the presence of deep love in a relationship is able to overcome many of the relationship's problems. Now, Farrell's research is interesting because that tends to fly in the face of the stereotypes our culture has. But nonetheless, I think that's important research that animates the background of what's going on in the intensification stage. So, to recap, the first stage is initiation, the second stage is experimentation, the third stage, intensification. If Romeo and Juliet have successfully navigated all of these stages, they're now ready to move to the fourth stage, which is what's called integration. Integration, the fourth stage, is intended to fuse the couple together. The key project is to harden the concrete of this relationship, to try and make the relationship more entwined, more entangled. Frankly, to make it harder for Romeo and Juliet to break up. The roots that were put down in the third intensification stage now begin to deepen and take hold in the ground such that it's hard to knock this tree over. So that analogy actually is a pretty good one because the integration stage oftentimes features communicative behaviors that are intended to make the couple harder to break apart. So, for example, one of the things that happens symbolically is they begin to designate common property. So this is where, for example, Romeo and Juliet might both put their names on the lease of an apartment. Or this is where Romeo and Juliet might get a pet, let's say a dog. Or it might be that Romeo and Juliet buy a car together and they put both of their names on the title of the car. Anyway, Whatever's going on symbolically brings the couple together because you're designating something in common. You're tying the couple together in a more significant manner. Now, this does not include marriage. That's going to be the next stage. Because really, this integration stage oftentimes is intended not just to deepen and fuse the couple together, but also to provide them, if necessary, a kind of exit. This is where there's a dramatic increase in the amount of joint decisions that are made. So now Romeo and Juliet begin to make the big decisions about life together. So Romeo and Juliet, as the semester ends in April, face the question of what they do during the summer. And so Romeo bases his summer plans on the conversation he has with Juliet. And so maybe Romeo decides to move to Juliet's hometown so they can spend the summer together rather than being apart. Or if Juliet is thinking of transferring, then she makes that decision based on her conversations with Romeo and gives her family less of a voice in it. And so she doesn't just make that decision on her own, she makes it with the input of, the advice of, and the agreement of Romeo. And so in Romeo and Juliet's example, these kinds of things are fusing the couple together. Outside of the relationship, everybody sees Romeo and Juliet and treats them as a unit. The treating of a couple as a unit by people outside the relationship acts to fuse the couple together because it reaffirms the centrality and significance of this romantic relationship in the eyes of people beyond the relationship. So everybody knows that Romeo and Juliet are together. So if there's ever a public event and we expect Juliet to be there, we know that Romeo will be there too, because everybody treats the couple as a kind of unit. Now, in this integration phase, there's another idea that becomes important. It's what's called rules testing. This comes from a researcher named Gordon Danke, which I know is kind of a strange name, D-A-H-N-K-E. D-A-H-N-K-E, Danke. It's actually a derivative of the German word for thank you. Anyway, Danke's research talks about these things called rules testing. And he starts with this observation. When romantic relationships begin, they tend to be governed by the rules that are created by society. So when Romeo and Juliet start dating, there's kind of a script to follow. There's a way that romantic relationships are expected to unfold. Society tells them, you do it this way. But the deeper Romeo and Juliet get into their relationship, the more their relationship begins to be governed by internal rules. So, for example, when Romeo and Juliet first get together, the overarching expectation is that even today, Romeo will be the one that asks out Juliet. And Romeo will be the one that tries to kind of guide the relationship. He takes the initiative, especially, for example, with respect to suggesting physical displays of affection. But the deeper they get into the relationship, in the integration stage, it's okay for Juliet to ask out Romeo. It's okay for Juliet to be the one that suggests sexual involvement. And so internally, they begin to develop their own rules. They begin to develop their own way of doing things. And so one of the things that Danke's research finds is that males oftentimes tend to nudge the relationship towards negotiating rules about power, whereas females tend to nudge the relationship into creating rules that govern support and contact. So what that means is that Romeo is more likely to try and create these internal rules that discern who has the power to do this or that. Whereas Juliet's interest in the integration stage is to develop unique rules to this relationship that govern when Romeo will support Juliet and how he will support Juliet. Regardless, for Danke, the key thing to look for is how the rules of a relationship become unique and begin to deviate perhaps from the larger societal rules. And in his research, he says this is a good thing because the couple is carving out their own identity, they're making things work for them, and they're not finding themselves beholden to the larger rules of a society. Another idea present in the integration stage comes from Denise Solomon. Solomon wants to talk about what's called a relational turbulence approach. Solomon believes that every romantic relationship will have its ups and downs, and so there's some natural turbulence built into any kind of a relationship. But one of the things that she says is that oftentimes in this integration stage, there is this struggle, this conflict between those two poles of autonomy and connection. That's the dialectic we talked about previously. You'll recall that back then we said that everybody is pulled at one point in time to having their own space, to being independent, to being free, to being their own person. That's autonomy. But obviously, if you're involved in a romantic relationship, you want connection. And in fact, here in this integration stage, you're really deepening and fusing together a couple so that that connection becomes even stronger. Well, that will put on more further and prominent display this tension between autonomy and connection. And so what Solomon argues is that in the integration stage, there's likely to be turbulence surrounding that. And so don't be surprised if there's greater conflict. Don't be surprised if there's greater angst. Don't be surprised if the relationship begins to be different because you're trying to figure out how connected versus how independent you want to be. And so for Solomon, this becomes a common source of turbulence. Now, that's not to say there isn't turbulence back in the intensification stage or even the experimentation stage. But here in this fourth stage, the turbulence becomes more prominent because the relationship now has become so significant that if you don't successfully manage the turbulence that comes from that dialectic, then you're going to have a very difficult time of it. If, for example, someone really would like for there to be more autonomy, but they tend to be muscled into or intimidated into or guilted into or pressured into honoring the connection end of it, that's likely to create turbulence. So for Solomon, she challenges Romeo and Juliet to be open and honest and forthright in their conversations, and to be very specific about how they feel regarding this tension of autonomy versus connection, because that, for Solomon, is a common source of turbulence in this particular stage. Now, there are some other kind of random ideas that float around the integration stage that I want to share with you, one of which is jealousy. We saw previously a little bit of jealousy when we talked about friendships, and we said that there could be some friendship jealousy that floats around certain kinds of friendships. In particular, earlier in this course, we talked about the jealousy that might occur when you are friends with someone who's going out with someone else. Well, here we look more narrowly at the research on jealousy as it applies to romantic relationships. And so one of the interesting things about jealousy is that it's multidimensional. You see, jealousy is, on the one hand, a response to a relational transgression. So Romeo might be jealous of Juliet if Juliet is spending too much time with Romeo's friend Tybalt. So there's a sense in which jealousy is a response to something that's happened. But there's also a sense in which jealousy is itself a relational transgression. That is to say, if Romeo acts like a jerk because he's jealous of Juliet and Tybalt, that will create conflict between he and Juliet. And so therefore his jealousy becomes a transgression. It becomes a problem in the relationship. Jealousy, of course, is a kind of concept that can only be understood in relationship to how people see that concept in the relationship. Some people are just naturally more jealous than other people are. And so therefore, how Romeo sees Juliet's relationship with Tybalt might be very different than how Juliet sees Romeo's relationship with Juliet's nurse. Because Juliet is perhaps by nature not a very jealous person. Romeo, on the other hand, might be a very jealous person. And so how jealousy works is defined in part by the relationship, but obviously in part by the personalities of the people involved. And by the way, jealousy is the kind of thing that is not quite as simple as you think that it is. Jealousy oftentimes can be understood as the prospect of losing something. It can also be seen through the lens of threat, that I feel a threat of something. Jealousy can be a kind of response to someone who feels as if their place is being taken. Jealousy can be seen as the kind of thing where people feel as if they're lacking a resource that someone else has. So Romeo might be jealous of the time that Juliet is spending with Tybalt, and so that jealousy is really framed in the form of a threat, that Tybalt has something that Juliet does not, which in this case, that Romeo does not, which in this case is Juliet's time. So jealousy has to be understood both as a threat and perhaps as a deprivation, and certainly as some kind of a loss of place. Which means, of course, that we can have the same kinds of jealousies that we talked about in previous models. There can be intimacy jealousy, where Romeo is jealous of how close that Juliet and Tybalt are. There can be power jealousy, where Romeo is jealous of the fact that Tybalt has some power over Juliet, because whenever Tybalt needs to talk, Juliet runs and talks with him. There could be some kind of romantic or sexual jealousy, where literally Romeo is afraid that Juliet and Tybalt are kissing, and that would obviously upset Romeo. Now, the key to most of the research on jealousy is what's called jealous rumination. Jealous rumination is this idea that we end up propagating the jealousy when we think about it. So if Romeo knows that Juliet is off talking to Tybalt because Tybalt needs some relationship advice, Romeo sits at home and he dwells on it, and he thinks about it, and he turns it over in his head, and he wonders what Juliet is doing right now, and he fumes at the fact that Juliet is with Tybalt right now and not with him, and he wonders if Romeo or if Juliet and Tybalt are touching one another in a sign of social support. And so the more he thinks about this, the worse the jealousy gets. So the research on jealousy finds that oftentimes the chief problem of jealousy resides in the way we ruminate on it. And so what makes Romeo a jealous person, in part, is the fact that he can't stop the jealous rumination. And so the problem with this is that we create a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more Romeo ruminates on whatever that threat is that he sees that Tybalt creates, the more he begins to see in Tybalt's actions that threat. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He expects Tybalt to do something that makes him jealous, and so whenever he sees anything, he reads that as a threat, and he then becomes jealous. It becomes a really vicious kind of a cycle. That's a very difficult cycle to break, but typically it begins with not ruminating. And so most researchers would say the key to reducing the amount of jealousy in a relationship is to eliminate the jealous rumination. Now, there are obviously constructive and destructive responses to jealousy. The constructive responses are the kinds of open sharing about the jealousy. So a constructive response to jealousy on the part of Romeo would be to say, Juliet, I got to be honest with you. I'm jealous. I'm really jealous of the time you spend with Tybalt. I know I shouldn't be. It's not an issue of trust. It's all in my head. I have to stop ruminating about it, but there it is. It's a constructive response. It articulates in a very clear fashion the source of the jealousy and perhaps what you would like to have happen. Obviously, the destructive responses are quite the obvious, right? Negative remarks, snide comments, throwing tantrums, spying on people, doing things to make Juliet jealous. All of those are unhelpful kinds of responses. And so what we find in the research is that most couples tend to fall into a discernible pattern of jealousy responses. If Romeo, for example, keeps his jealousy inside and instead decides to act passive-aggressively toward Juliet, clearly that's not helpful. But that might be his jealousy script. It might be how he responds to the jealousy. And the only way that Juliet and Romeo are going to make any progress with Romeo's jealousy is if the two of them talk about it openly. If he avoids all of that and adopts a negative, destructive kind of response, then that's not going to help at all. In the midst of all this are what are called rival-focused responses. These are not necessarily constructive nor destructive, but instead they're focused on communicating something to the perceived rival. So now what Romeo does is whenever he and Juliet are around Tybalt, he makes a point to put his arm around Juliet, or he makes a point to glare at Tybalt, or he makes these snide, snarky comments toward Tybalt. The fact of the matter is, regardless of what's going on, there's some kind of communication directed from Romeo to the rival, which in this case is Tybalt. Jealousy is the kind of thing that can really, really damage a relationship, a significant damage to it. It's the kind of thing that has to be managed. And we find that jealousy can occur at any of the stages in the romantic relationships, but it typically tends to take deeper hold in the integration stage than it does anywhere else. So Romeo and Juliet have made it from initiation to experimentation, then on to the third stage, which is intensification. They've made it to the fourth stage, which is integration. If things are going really well in their relationship, they make it to bonding. In the bonding stage of a relationship, you're cementing the relationship permanently. You're getting married. You're imagining yourself as committing yourself to this person forever. Now, you might legally be married, or you might move in together, or you might just leave it open-ended as a long-term relationship. Regardless, there's no way in your mind you imagine this romantic relationship ending. Now, there's not a whole lot of research to be talked about here because what we find is that typically when people make it to the bonding stage, either they get married, which jumps us into the research I talk about in my family communication class. And that research on husbands and wives is rather different than the research about what happens among couples that simply live together. And so in the bonding stage, typically either it's a short period of time, like engagement before people are married, or it's the marital stage, in which case we jump into that other area of research I talked about a moment ago. But the key to the bonding stage is to understand that people are cementing this relationship together. And so as they cement that relationship together, one of the things they involve themselves in are what are called relational stories. William Wilmot is someone we've met previously in this class, and he talks about the role that relational stories play. Wilmot says that one of the ways that relationships are bonded together is by telling stories about the relationship, the how we met story, the time we broke up story, that ski trip to Colorado story, the time we visited your parents at Thanksgiving story. And one of the things that Wilmot wants to talk about is how talking about those stories, sharing the stories with each other, sharing the stories with people outside the relationship, all act to reaffirm and resupport the bonding of the relationship. Because those stories both harken backwards to previous experiences, but they also reaffirm what's going on in the present. So the story about how Romeo and Juliet took a ski trip to Colorado and the car broke down on the way there and they couldn't make it all the way to Colorado. They had to spend a couple of days in Kansas waiting for their car to get fixed. But while they were in Kansas, they went off and found some cool stuff to do. And they really understood at that moment in time that maybe they could make this relationship work out. That story, as is told again and again, affirms love conquers all, or it affirms God's providential hand in the relationship. And so when Romeo and Juliet tell that story to each other, or they share it with their small group at church, they're reaffirming something special about their relationship. And so Wilmot believes that relational stories become really, really important. And he wants to point out how oftentimes those stories are edited. We oftentimes leave out the bad parts of stories and retain the good parts of stories. Ironically, in Wilmot's research, when marriages begin to fall apart, or when long-term relationships head toward breaking up, we go back and revise those stories. And when things are falling apart, we add into those stories the kinds of negative aspects we had previously left out of those stories when things were good. And so for Wilmot, the stories we tell oftentimes become pretty good indicators of where people are in these stages. By the way, in the bonding stage, most couples tend to land somewhere on a continuum in terms of the closeness of the relationship. Imagine a continuum with 3 points on it. Okay? At the far end is what's called an enmeshed couple. An enmeshed couple is a couple that spends all their time together. They're always around one another. Their lives are deeply intertwined. They are stuck on one another. They do everything together. They're rarely apart. They're enmeshed. They make all their decisions together. They share every meal together. They are always with each other. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you have a separate couple where they just don't seem to spend as much time together. They live in the same house, but they have separate interests. They might take separate vacations. They share some meals together, but not all. Their schedules might be opposite. He works second shift, she works first shift. Their lives are very separate. It's the exact opposite of this enmeshed couple. And then in the middle are what are called independent couples, where, as you might imagine, they're somewhat enmeshed, but they also have a lot of independence. And it shouldn't surprise you that this continuum that I laid out between an enmeshed couple and a separate couple tends to respond, or tends to fit very well with the notion of autonomy versus connection that I talked about earlier. Enmeshed couples really value connection, and they put in place rules, expectations, patterns of interaction that privilege connection, so they become enmeshed. Other couples, separate couples, they privilege autonomy, so they put in place the rules, the patterns of interaction, the scripts, and all of that privileges autonomy. And then obviously the independent couples are somewhere in the middle. So what researchers say is that by the time they get to the bonding stage, most couples fall somewhere on this continuum. And wherever they fall on that continuum is where they continue to stay. In the bonding stage, affective affirmation is also an important concept. Affective affirmation are the words or the gestures you use to communicate to your relational partner that you're caring for them, that they are special to you, that you love them. Now, this is not quite the same thing as love languages, because love languages is how we would like to have love or affection expressed to us. Affective affirmation is when we're providing to someone else what we think they need to have. So in a sense, the affective affirmation is the language we're providing people, whereas love languages are the languages we want to hear from people. And there's a lot of research that finds that when you can balance those out to where I'm providing the kind of affective affirmation that you're seeking, then the relationship is likely to be successful. And of course, this is typically found through trial and error. But the key thing about the bonding stage is that by this stage in a romantic relationship, this is when people are really, truly able to understand what it is the relational partner needs to have expressed to them. And by the way, this affective affirmation is not just the provision of love and support. It's not just saying your love language is words of affirmation. Okay, I'll provide that. This affective affirmation is actually bigger than that because it's ways to affirm the relationship, not just the person. You're affirming the relationship. It's the gestures, it's the words, it's the symbols, it's the nonverbal communication that affirms the relationship as well as the people that are in it. Well, as you can see, there's a lot going on here in these established stages of romantic relationships. The intensification stage deepens things. The integration stage fuses people together. And the bonding stage makes it as permanent as it can possibly be. So if Romeo and Juliet are able to make it that far, then life is good and they're well positioned for success. But unfortunately, not every relationship makes it. And so in the next module, we'll talk about the research that Mark Knapp and others have done on the disintegration of romantic relationships. And sadly, we'll break up Romeo and Juliet. So that's where we're headed next.